Welcome to the second season of Highly Sensitive Money. I'm really excited to be sharing. This next season will have a mixture of highly sensitive people sharing about their money story. I have a lot of therapists, a lot of entrepreneurs, and I'll also be speaking with financial planners who focus on social justice. Today's first episode will be the only solo episode of the season, and I'll be talking about my parents. I actually drew up a list of all of the things they taught me about money, both positive and negative. And I was thinking of giving this to them for Mother's Day and Father's Day. I mean, I'm a few months late, but still, the sentiment is still here. And this idea came about because I was talking with a friend about building up credit and like different little things. And I said, my parents actually did a really good job of teaching me the life skills that when it comes to money. So I'm going to share this both just as to set the groundwork of like how I even got into this work and why I do feel like I have a sense of ease with money, and also to share with parents like different things you could do for your own children. I wrote down the lessons my parents gave me in no particular order. It was just kind of like as they came to me. So I'm going to be sharing them as they come to me. The first thing I remembered is my dad would always say, earn here. And he would put his hand right around his forehead, and spend here. And he would put his hand right in the middle of his chest, right? So there was a difference between earning more and spending less. That was a core thing that I remember. Must have been like 10 years old when I was hearing my dad say this. Take care of your credit. For both of them, they were always saying, take care of your credit. And both of my parents were born in Mexico and grew up in Mexico, but they somehow know that in the US, you had to have good credit. I mean, they had bought houses, they had bought cars, they knew how credits were used. They always told me never ever carry credit card debt, always pay it off every month. And I was diligent enough that I did do that. I always made sure to pay off my credit card. I barely used it really up until I left college. And then I built up some credit card debt, given that I didn't have a job. I was in unemployment. And then my mom actually built up my credit when she put me on her car loan. I think I was in college, so I must have been 19, and my mom took out a car and she put me down as a co-signer on the loan. And I mean, I had nothing to do with the car. I didn't make payments, I didn't drive the car, but I was a co-signer, and that really, really built up my credit. One lesson that I learned through seeing it go badly was don't lend your credit to others. Unfortunately, my mom did lend her credit to a family member, and the family member did not use it wisely, and that really created a huge rift. And yeah, that was very difficult, but that was something again that I learned while I was in college. Be aware of why you're spending. Now, my parents never really said this, and I think this is another one that I learned through seeing them do it poorly. My dad always has this story of when my family moved from our starter home that was 3 bedrooms to the home that my dad really dreamed of, which was much bigger. He said that at that time he could have bought a duplex, like a quadruplex in our town, and that my mom really wanted to do that, but that my dad was really motivated by having status through things. So that's definitely something that my dad's had to work through. But he wanted to have something that was impressive, right? Spending money to be impressive as opposed to spending money because it would be better for his financial situation. And I think at the end of the day, he's happy he had it because he did and eventually go up and buy a house similar to it. But that was something I learned about why are you spending the money that you're spending? Another lesson through negative lessons, learn about the stock market. My dad lost a lot of money in the market. I don't actually know how much, but I must have been in middle school, and I remember the arguments that came out of it. And my parents actually never went back to the stock market. My mom uses it lightly for her retirement, and here I am, a financial planner who's focused on retirement, who's helping people invest, and neither of my parents will dip their toe in. My mom a little bit more, but it's very conservative. Real estate and rental income is the goal, yet bubbles happen. For both of my parents, rental income, having real estate is really, really their main focus. And I think for most people, because it makes a lot of intuitive sense, right? You buy property, you build it up, and then it becomes something useful. Do work that gives you specialized skills. This was when I was in my mid 20s, early 20s, mid 20s. I was considering becoming a Mary Kay salesperson. And I remember talking about it with my dad, and my dad's like, well, is that really going to give you a unique skill that you'll then be able to sell? Like, is that really the best use of your time? He just asked me that. And I remember thinking like, well, it could be good for me to sell Mary Kay because it'll get me more into a sales position so I can start practicing if I ever become an entrepreneur, because I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. But I decided against it, and I'm glad I did, because I've learned that hardcore sales like Mary Kay is not for me. Work can be enjoyable. I'm so grateful my parents taught me that. Both of them. I too have struggled with workaholism, like only doing work for enjoyment. But it is a really beautiful experience to have had. My first experience of work was, I must have been in middle school, maybe in elementary school. But I remember during backpack season, so my parents sold purses, and we sold, like, our big times of sales were Mother's Day, going back to school season, and Christmas. So when going back to school season, I remember we were selling backpacks, $5 for a simple backpack, and standing in front of our shop at the swap meet and having the sales happen so quickly. It felt incredible to be dispatching and having all of these people ask me questions and serving all of them. It was just exhilarating to be in the hustle and bustle of commerce. And it really taught me that work can be enjoyable. It was an adrenaline rush. I loved it. And I still do feel that often when I'm like in a spreadsheet, or I'm helping a client draft the plan, or I'm in a deep conversation around like money patterns and money traumas. I feel really happy. So I'm really grateful that I do feel that work can be enjoyable. And honestly, I recently, for Father's Day, which was just a few weeks ago when I'm recording this, I had a conversation with my dad, and he was saying like, it's the secret, like just enjoy what you do, and it'll be much easier to do it because you'll be internally motivated to do the work. A next lesson, and both of my parents taught me, risks are part of entrepreneurship. So the story that comes to mind is my mom tells me that when they were first starting their purse business, they would go up to LA, which was 4 hours away. We lived in a tiny town in Calexico. And my dad would say, one of all the purses. He would buy one of each. And my mom was like, we're never going to make it ahead if we don't buy more, if we don't take the risk to buy a box of different purses. Right? So she started buying a box of different purses to get a break in the cost, to get a lower cost, because she was buying volume. And that's eventually how they started to grow their business skills. And my mom has been a natural business person since forever. She talks about being 13 years old, 12 years old, and like needing some spending money. She's a really good cook. So her first venture, I believe, was to make menudo. Menudo is this Mexican dish with hominy and tripe. So she would make menudo when she was 12, 13 years old and sell it. And she's an amazing cook. So people bought it, and then she'd have spending money. You know, she had to like put the money together. I don't know if she used the family's groceries or if she went out and bought her own groceries. I don't know if it was actually like my family just giving her the stuff for her then to go sell it, or if she was doing the whole entrepreneurial thing herself. But still, it was a lot of self-initiative. Use your skills to work. Right? What skills do you have, and how can they make them work? So my dad became an engineer because he was good at math. So when he was in school, his grandmother would always tell him like, unless you want to be working the fields, you've got to stay in school. And my dad does not like working the fields. My dad's not a physical labor kind of man. So he focused on engineering. He focused on math. He knew that he could get a job that way. I think later on, my dad wishes he had studied business or commerce or politics, or he really would have liked to have been a lawyer. But at the time, like most of us that go to college, he was just trying to figure out, how do I make money? How do I get ahead? My mom, again, she's a natural born saleswoman, selling menudo at 13. They told me about the importance of picking your career. Again, so I just shared that my dad became an engineer by default because he was good at math. And now I feel like he would have loved being a lawyer. My mom, she went to nursing school following her cousin's lead. And her grandfather, my tata Eduardo, had told her that she should go into business. Because, I mean, here was this 13-year-old girl selling menudo, like, right? But she said, like, when she imagined business, she just thought it was going to be like a tiny little abarrotes, a tiny little corner store selling some like sad tomatoes. She always says that, like, I just imagine myself being bored inside this business all day selling some sad tomatoes. But really, my great grandfather, her grandfather, did see something in her. This next lesson, it's very anti-capitalist, but Walmart destroys small businesses. Again, I was in elementary school, somewhere between 8 and 11 years old. And my dad was telling me, like, you know how when you go to Walmart, there's one greeter in the front? That person's making sure that nothing gets stolen. But here in the swap meet, there's a ton of little stores, and each of them has a greeter, also making sure that nothing gets stolen. Like, as the greeter, that was basically your job, just to make sure that nobody walked out with anything they hadn't paid for. And it reminds me of, like, wow, our family did struggle when Walmart came to town, like the way that our finances had been changed. And that's part of the reason that we ended up leaving Calexico. And then my dad, I think I was a teenager at this point. My dad was talking to me about capitalism and socialism and how roads are treated in the US versus Mexico. He said, like, if the US were truly a capitalist country, they would charge for roads the way that they charge for roads in Mexico. Because in Mexico, they have toll booths for everything. It's really kind of annoying because Mexico's a socialist state. But I guess if you're using the highway, you've got to pay tolls, which is much more capitalist. You only pay for what you use as opposed to providing a public good. La tierra es el que la trabaja, and the failed ejido experiment. In Mexico, I believe after the 1910 revolution, there was a movement to give land back to the people because, again, so Mexico's stolen land, right? Like, just every country in the Americas is stolen land. So there was the idea of, like, we're going to give this back to the people who work it. The land belongs to those who work it is literally the translation of la tierra es del que la trabaja. And yet my dad talks about growing up and one of those experiments where, like, land was given back to the people. And he says it didn't work. So his experience was that people didn't have the skills, the machinery, the capital to really invest and make the land work. Because he's like, if you get a piece of land in the middle of the desert that doesn't have any electricity, that doesn't have any running water, like, who is going to be able to make that kind of investment, right? So it was kind of, yeah, it's like a piece of sadness because he says he remembers going to the like, hearing about the meetings, seeing his family work on it. His grandmother, I think, was a bit of a local politician in a very informal way. They taught me that migration is part of life. So my grandmother moved from La Tinaja, which is in Sonora, to Santa Ana, a bigger town. And then they moved to Sarik, they moved to Mexicali, they moved to the US, and they always just kept moving in search of a better life, in search of work, in search of more comfort, but not even comfort, just like stability, financial stability. Like, sometimes I think that my parents are in some way like economic refugees. Not really, but they knew that their opportunities in the US working at a swap meet were much higher than staying in Mexico working as an engineer or a nurse. Right? They were both professionally trained. They taught me that it's okay for teenagers to leave home. My mom at 14 left her home to go live with her grandmother, so she wasn't very far, but to go to middle school because the town where she lived, there wasn't a middle school. At 16, I moved abroad to study in France, lived with a French family. My dad became he became an orphan at 18. So again, it's like teenagers are like, okay, you're old enough to go make it happen, and like that indirectly is a money lesson because I've never had the idea that anyone was going to take care of me, which I mean, in some ways it's a little stressful, but in other ways it made me very self-sufficient. And I also want to shout out that, like, I remember my dad bought me a computer. My dad helped me with my rent a lot when I was in college. My mom is always really lavish with her gifts. Like, she will show up with a television or a couch, like I would borrow money from them and then pay it back at 0% interest with very flexible payment terms. Like, my parents were definitely present financially and able to provide. At the end of the day, though, I knew the expectation was that I would be paying my own bills. Like, they could help with one-offs, but really it was on me, and that I could do it. That's the other thing, that I could do it. They taught me that things do not bring happiness. And I feel like I learned this by seeing them look for things to bring happiness. We downsized from the large home that we'd lived in to follow my mom and dad's respective dreams. Like, we moved from Calexico, where we were doing well financially, to LA because my mom really wanted to improve her English and she wanted to move away from the border. She wanted to have her family experience more of the US. And my dad agreed with the idea that he would get a master's degree, right? So he went back to school. They told me, use available government support, and there's always a way. Right? So they taught me that, like, Medicare is available, use Medicare. There's free food, get the free food. Like, there was no shame in using any resources available to you. And that's really empowering. So when I was in college, I had a Medicaid provided by California up until I turned 19. And then when I turned 19, I had no health insurance and I didn't have money to pay for health insurance. And my mom was like, go figure out how to get it. Like, just go, what do you need to do to get Medicaid? What do you need to do to get the services that are available to you in the US? My dad would always say that it's easier to be really poor or very rich in the US than to be in between. Because when you're very poor, you have more government assistance. And when you're very rich, you can cover it on your own. But if you're in between, things can be really expensive. They taught me that family responsibility is beautiful, and that it can be a downward spiral, right? Because there's something about if one of us, my mom was in the sense like the provider for her family in a lot of ways, and like providing different opportunities, providing cash, providing loans. And in some ways, like, people didn't actually go out and do it on their own. So both my brother and I are very independent financially, but a lot of my family on my mom's side isn't. They taught me to save aggressively for opportunities and peace of mind. My mom is actually who taught me this. She is a very hardcore saver, a saguaro. If anybody wants to go find out what their money tree is, check out the money archetypes quiz that I've created. But she's a hardcore saguaro, and it's worked for her. She's been able to take advantage of so many opportunities because she had squirreled away some cash. I'm also very, very lucky that my parents taught me the love of school and education. Both of them are huge readers. Both of them love school. My mom would be in school forever if she could. And I'm really lucky that that's also my case. I mean, again, the society that we live in is set up for people like that. So I feel, again, very blessed that my brain works in that way and that it was modeled to me. My mom taught me the joy of providing others work. And my dad does this too. But for example, because my family had a store, we were always hiring our family members, hiring friends. My mom tells this beautiful story of hiring Claudia, who then later on went to open up her own store and was able to learn English. And although my family paid low wages in the US, their wages were higher than what someone would be able to earn in Mexico, right? So they gave a lot of people a heads up. My mom taught me, again, the joy of buying things on sale. I remember in middle school, the love and happiness I felt when we would go from the valley. We lived up in Montrose near Glendale, and we would go down to LA because I was getting braces and I was getting them at USC because, again, it's cheaper to do it with students. Often on our way back, we would stop at the Grand Central Market in LA to buy discounted bread that was just about to expire. So my mom would get home and freeze it. Just buy discounted all kinds of things. So the joy of buying things on sale. Again, the joy of commerce. I remember even though when we left Calexico, my mom didn't go back to having a store. She did always work at swap meets. She always figured out a way to make some extra cash. And when I graduated from college and I was in between jobs, I started selling purses myself. I would do like purse parties, similar to like the Mary Kay example I talked about earlier. So I guess in some ways I already knew how to do Mary Kay, but I loved it. I love like hauling over my purses, setting them all around, making the thing nice for people. Unfortunately, I learned through my mom that scams are real. My mom, I was able to like make a profit when I was in college on scholarships. My first year, I made a profit and I gave it to my mom. She was a single mom. She had my brother. My dad wasn't doing very well financially. My parents had already gotten divorced. And my mom was scammed out of that money. And that felt really sad. And I was angry for several years until I just learned to let it go. Like, scams are real, is what I learned from my mom's experience. Comprehensive car insurance is the way to go. Being from California, comprehensive car insurance is required. But later on, when I left California and moved to Pennsylvania, I'm really grateful that I had it. So that wasn't my parents that taught me as much as it was like life experiences taught me that. Be meticulous about tracking sales and creating projections. This one, another shout out to my mom. She always had these like handwritten notebooks where she would write down all everyday's sales, the sales for the week, the sales for the month, and she would compare it to previous years. She had like her own meticulous projections just to see how things were doing in comparison to what she'd expected before. Consumerism has people controlled. This is one of my dad's favorite topics. He loves talking about how people are so numbed out because they're so focused on consuming. And I think he's telling this from life experience, right? Like I shared earlier that my dad decided to like get a big house instead of getting a duplex because he wanted to be impressive. Like now I think he sees through that. Apantallar is the word for impressing others in Spanish. So apantallar is a waste of money and it doesn't make you more money. So that's my mom's point of view. You could imagine some of the financial tension in my house with like my dad wanting to impress others and my mom being like, but that's not going to help our family or make us money, right? That was a very key difference in their financial approaches. Through my parents' own prosperity story, like they are truly rags to riches many times over. They've both gone through like serious debt things. My mom has to go through a foreclosure. Like they've gone through really, really difficult financial times multiple times, you know? And their resilience is beautiful, but they also showed me that like money comes and goes. And yes, save for opportunities, but know that when you're down to nothing, it's okay. My mom always tells the story of like after the divorce, it was very difficult financially for everyone involved. She showed up in Calexico with like nothing to her name, you know, just like a tiny amount of cash, 2 children, and a lot of heartache. And slowly over the next 10 years, she went back and built up something that's going to last now, right? She like saved up for her retirement. She made sure my brother and I were as settled as we could be. So I really appreciate the lessons that my parents taught me through doing things well, through not doing things well too. And I'm also going to share a few things that I learned later on my own. How to have and enjoy a budget. So my parents were not budgeters as much as they were don't spend anything was more of their approach. But I learned how to have and enjoy a budget with a good mentor, Pauline. And I talk about Pauline in an article I wrote about mentoring. So I'll link that to this. Giving myself permission to spend on joy and pleasure. Right? This was actually a really tough lesson to learn. As a woman, as a Mexican woman, I was very much socialized to put everybody's comfort above my own. So whenever I wanted anything, I often questioned it. I thought I was being selfish. I remember there was a particular time where my cousin was going through a really difficult time with addiction issues, just to be transparent. And I was going to buy myself a bicycle. It was right during the pandemic. I didn't want to take public transportation because I didn't want to be on buses. The buses were not as reliable. And I really needed to have like a safe way to be outside and exercise now that I didn't have the gym. And I felt guilty because the bicycle I wanted was not the cheapest one on the market. It wasn't the most expensive one either, but it was more than I expected to be reasonable on a bike. And like, how dare I want a bicycle? It's so silly. I mean, but the topic is funny, right? Like, how dare I want a bicycle, a way of transportation, a way of exercising, a way of socializing, while my cousin was going through this difficult thing. But I moved through it, and like I was able to do both in some sense. I helped out my cousin to the extent that I could, and I got that bicycle, which I used for years. I truly, truly loved my bicycle. I even named it Georgette. I learned how to pay off principal more quickly. My parents are not ones to ever have debt. They probably had a mortgage and they had car loans, but they never financed anything with debt. So they didn't really talk to me about it. But I learned after college how to like pay that off more quickly because I got myself into some debt. I learned about taxes. I think that was really being a certified financial planner. You have to learn about taxes. So that was fun. I like it. I learned about maximizing Social Security, saving for retirement, be clear on family loans versus family gifts. That was something that I learned through my mom's own trial and error with family and like the different dynamics that were at play there. And then one of the most recent things I've learned as an entrepreneur is the joy of paying people. My mom talked a little bit about like how good it felt to provide work. And I know my dad's provided work for many family members in many different times. But the joy of really like paying people an appropriate wage, a wage that's like a livable wage, like that's part of my business goals, is to earn enough so that when I do contract out, hire out, I pay people well. So, with all of that sharing of really what money was like for me growing up, but most importantly, like what I learned both from my parents, good decisions, bad decisions, at the end of the day, like everything that we go through, be it with money, relationships, friendships, work, it's really it's really an opportunity to learn. That's one of the my favorite parts about myself. I have very much like a growth mindset, like it is possible for things to be better than they are right now, and also learning to enjoy the present. So there needs to be like holding the paradox of striving towards what we want while knowing that life just as it is good. So I'm bringing in a little bit of my Buddhism that I've learned in the past decade or two. Thank you so much for really taking in today's episode. I would love to hear, what did people learn from their parents? Good, bad, indifferent. What do they want to teach their kids? That's also so important for listeners that have children. One of my favorite exercises that I've ever heard of for really teaching kids about money is to write them a letter. So say that something happens, you get hit by a bus, you have a heart attack, and you drop dead in the next 10 minutes. What would you want your children to know about money? What would you want your children to know about your money story, your money beliefs, things that you want them to do? Like my dad saying, earn more than you spend. My mom having so much joy in creating work for others, right? My parents didn't actually write down all this stuff. I'm lucky to be 36 and still have them with me, but they did teach me this. By doing the exercise of writing out what you'd like your kids to learn, you'll actually start teaching them this stuff. And you've got to be age appropriate, right? Like you don't want the 2-year-old to know about principal payment. Maybe you want them to know about sharing and our communal, how interrelated we are, right? It's at the end of the day, it's like your decision, what you decide to share. But I do invite you to take a step back and consider, what do you want to teach your kids? For those of us who don't have children, take a step back and consider, what did you learn? What serves you? What no longer serves you? At the end of the day, like we leave our parents' home physically, but a lot of the times we just go out there and recreate what we grew up with, which may or may not be serving you. I look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode in the second season of Highly Sensitive Money, where we talk about money, social justice, and how to do this well as a highly sensitive person. To learn more about my services, check out my website, allthecolors.net, where you can also find a really fun link to a quiz on money archetypes, because understanding our own patterns with money makes it much easier to make changes and get to where we want to go. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.